The power went out just as I was seasoning my steak. At first, I figured it was just a blown fuse. Happens. But when I stepped outside to check the box, I saw something that made my blood boil. A landscaping crew was standing around my power line severed, lying in the dirt like some forgotten garden hose. One of them was actually laughing. I stormed over, jaw clenched. "Hey! Who told you to dig there?" The oldest guy, wearing a safety vest 2 sizes too big, looked up and shrugged. "Got orders from the HOA president, said this was shared utility space." My name's Kellan Grady. I'm a former HVAC tech, semi-retired now, and I've lived in this neighborhood for 8 years without incident until Cassandra Whitmore got herself elected president of the HOA board last spring. Cassandra was everything you'd expect from an HOA Karen. Mid-50s, frosted bob, a voice like sandpaper on glass, and a pathological need to be in control. She once issued me a written warning for having excessively masculine wind chimes. I jogged up the road to her place, still fuming. Her porch had more security cameras than a Vegas casino. I rang the bell twice. She opened the door wearing tennis whites and a smug expression. "Kellan," she said like my name tasted bad, "if this is about the crew, I already know you cut my power line." "I didn't cut anything," she said, arms crossed. "The board approved routine landscaping along the easement. Your connection must have been improperly installed." I stared at her. "That's a lie, and you know it. That line's been inspected twice. And it's not in the easement, it runs straight from the junction to my house across my yard." "Well," she huffed, "I suppose mistakes happen. Not 30 feet into private property they don't." She turned to go inside. "File a complaint if you must." "Oh, I did more than that." I called the power company immediately and they dispatched a technician within the hour. He took one look and said, "Whoever did this is in deep trouble." He documented everything. Photos, measurements, the whole works. Turns out, the severed line was a direct underground feed, and cutting it not only knocked out my power but damaged one of their distro nodes. The repair, $27,000. And guess who they held liable by the end of the week? Cassandra got the bill with her name on it. The next morning, I was standing on my porch with a lukewarm cup of instant coffee when a white sedan with a county seal on the door pulled up in front of Cassandra Whitmore's house. A man in slacks and a windbreaker stepped out, clipboard in hand. He didn't bother with the walkway, just marched across her pristine lawn and knocked. I didn't need to hear what was said. The way she planted her hands on her hips and jabbed a finger toward my house told me everything I needed to know. The county inspector stayed calm, flipping through his paperwork, while Cassandra's voice rose to a pitch that made a pair of crows take off from her roof. She must have been expecting a slap on the wrist, maybe a warning. What she got instead was a citation, civil code violation for unauthorized excavation across private property without permit or consent. The county even flagged the HOA for not reporting utility interference prior to the landscaping work. I didn't gloat, not yet, but I wasn't done either. By Thursday, I had a meeting scheduled with a municipal attorney from the county legal office. Turns out, this wasn't the first time the HOA had gone rogue with property boundaries. 2 years ago, they'd paved a walking trail that ran 10 feet into private lots along the eastern perimeter of the neighborhood, quietly settled out of court after one homeowner threatened a class action. I asked the attorney, "Is this enough of a pattern to open a formal inquiry?" He raised an eyebrow. "You got documentation?" I handed him a file folder, copies of the property survey, the utility map, a sworn statement from the repair technician, and images showing the severed conduit. The attorney flipped through them slowly, nodding once. "Let me make a few calls." That was the start of something bigger. By the following week, the HOA board received a notice of pending investigation from the County Development and Enforcement Division. Cassandra tried to downplay it in the monthly newsletter, calling it a review of procedural compliance, but the truth was already spreading. The neighbor across the street, Ron Haskins, came over that night with a 6-pack and a story of his own. Last year, she made me tear down my tool shed. Said it violated setback rules. I found out later she'd never filed the complaint properly, just sent me a fake violation form with HOA letterhead. I stared at him. You serious? Ron nodded. I kept the paper, didn't know what to do with it. Can I borrow it? He handed it over. The font was off, the signature line blank, and the form code didn't match any legitimate documents from the HOA's manual. I added it to the growing stack of evidence. By the time the county investigator returned, I had a dozen pages of resident affidavits detailing fabricated fines, misappropriated dues, and unannounced rule changes. Cassandra had been running the board like a private fiefdom, and no one had ever pushed back until now. The investigator, a woman named Valeria, knocked on my door the following Tuesday. She was sharp-eyed, efficient, and carried a digital recorder clipped to her belt. I've reviewed your documentation, she said. We're preparing a formal deposition request for the board. In the meantime, I'd like to walk the property line with you. We spent the next hour charting the exact boundary where the landscaping crew had dug. She took GPS-tagged photos and paced out the distance from the junction box. When we reached the spot where the conduit had been cut, Valeria crouched to examine the fresh fill. Did anyone from the board ask your permission before this work was done? No, I said. No notice, no contact. They just showed up and started digging. She stood, brushing soil from her gloves. We'll be requesting the contractor's work order and the HOA's authorization forms. If those don't match up, it could escalate to criminal damage. 2 days later, it did. A police cruiser rolled into the neighborhood just after lunch. Officer DeSoto, a local liaison with the Property Crimes Unit, knocked on Whitmore's door with a warrant in hand. Apparently, the landscaping company had no written contract. The entire job had been arranged over a phone call, no permits, no insurance, no documentation. And the kicker: Cassandra had used HOA funds to pay for it. When the officer escorted her down the porch steps, a few neighbors gathered quietly, watching from their yards. No one said a word. No one needed to. The charges weren't anything Hollywood-worthy: misuse of association funds, criminal mischief, failure to obtain proper permits. But they were enough to get her temporarily removed from the board pending investigation. The board's vice president, a nervous man named Eugene who once fined a teenager for sidewalk chalk, stepped in as interim head. That night, I got a knock at my door. It was Eugene, holding a clipboard and wearing the expression of someone who just walked into a job interview he didn't want. I'd like to apologize, he said. The board didn't approve that landscaping job. Cassandra acted unilaterally. You still let her run unchecked. He shifted uncomfortably. She had a way of pressuring people, but that's no excuse. I leaned against the doorframe. If you want to make it right, start with transparency. Release the financials. Show the residents where their dues went. He hesitated. We'd need a vote. Then hold one. Public meeting, no closed doors, no email ballots. He nodded slowly. I'll schedule it. By the end of the week, flyers were posted on every mailbox announcing the first open HOA meeting in over 3 years. The community center filled faster than anyone expected. People brought receipts, photos, even voice recordings. What started as a simple complaint about a severed power line was now a full-blown reckoning. One resident, a nurse named Alyssa, stood up and read a statement about being fined $200 for decorative clutter after putting out a small bench for her elderly mother. Another man, a retired Marine, revealed that he'd been charged for unauthorized foliage after planting milkweed to attract monarch butterflies. Every testimony built momentum. By the time I spoke, the room was beyond silent. It was focused. I didn't come here to burn the place down, I said. I came here because I got tired of being bullied in my own yard, and I know I'm not the only one. Someone in the back shouted, "You're damn right." The vote that followed wasn't even close. The board was dissolved pending re-election, and a temporary oversight committee was formed made up of volunteers from the neighborhood, including myself, Ron, and Alyssa. Cassandra's face never appeared again. Her house went up for sale 3 weeks later. Rumor had it she was moving to Florida. No one wished her a good journey, and the $27,000 bill. The HOA had to pay it from the Community Legal Reserve Fund. But this time, everyone knew exactly where the money came from and why. The new board formed 6 weeks later with mandatory term limits, transparent budgeting, and a community approval clause for all major projects. Power lines stayed intact. Wind chimes were no longer regulated, and every homeowner got a printed copy of their rights and property boundaries. We didn't just fix a broken conduit, we rebuilt the foundation of the neighborhood. The first real sign that things were changing came on a fog-heavy Thursday morning, when a city works truck arrived to repaint the faded street lines and fire lane markings. No one had requested it except the newly formed HOA Oversight Committee, which now had direct liaisons with the Municipal Services Office. The worker I spoke to said it was the first time in years the neighborhood had filed a collective maintenance request through proper channels. People noticed. More interestingly, the HOA's old storage room, a locked unit in the back of the community center, was opened for the first time in memory. Eugene handed me the key with a nervous look. "If there's anything weird in there," he said, "I never saw it." Inside, the place was a mess. Yellowing paper files stacked in milk crates, a dusty metal cabinet without labels, and 2 boxes marked Archive Do Not Remove. I pulled on gloves and got to work. By that afternoon, I had found something unusual: receipts for cash withdrawals, dozens of them, each one signed off by Cassandra. They weren't huge, usually between $200 and $400, but they were frequent, sometimes 3 or 4 a month. The memo lines were vague: event supplies, dues adjustment, decorative budget. But no one ever remembered seeing that money in action. "Did the board ever host events?" I asked Ron later that evening. "Outside of that one wine mixer 4 years ago, not a thing," he said, polishing off the last of his sandwich. "You think she was skimming? Feels like it. But if she took HOA dues in cash, that's not just unethical. That's embezzlement." I contacted Valeria, the county investigator. She met me at the community center 2 days later, this time with someone from the city auditor's office. They spent 3 hours going through the documents, photographing every withdrawal slip and cross-referencing it against the HOA's annual budget reports. By sunset, they had found over 37 undocumented withdrawals, totaling just shy of $12,000. "This isn't just shady," the auditor said. "This is criminal misappropriation of funds, and if she deposited any of this into her personal account, it's traceable." They filed a preliminary report that night. The next morning, an official complaint was lodged with the district attorney's office. The case was upgraded from civil violation to criminal investigation. About a week later, I got a call from a woman named Dana, who said she used to serve on the HOA board before Cassandra took over. She'd moved 2 blocks away, outside of the HOA's jurisdiction, but had heard what was happening through mutual friends. She used to keep 2 sets of books, Dana told me. One for the board and one she never let anyone else see. I caught her once with a ledger she wouldn't explain. The next morning, my resignation letter was already typed and waiting in my inbox, supposedly written by me. I asked if she still had access to anything from her time on the board. She said she'd saved an old flash drive from a board email archive, just in case. She dropped it off in a padded envelope the next day. I plugged it into an old laptop and found something chilling: a PDF labeled Dues Compliance Strategy. It was a list of homeowners, color-coded by what Cassandra referred to as soft targets, people she believed could be pushed into paying more with fabricated violations or ambiguous rule enforcement. Notes next to names read like threats: single income pressure with maintenance fine, elderly unlikely to contest, non-native speaker avoid detailed notices. I sat there staring at the screen for a long time. This wasn't just mismanagement, it was targeted exploitation. And it had gone on for years. I turned the file over to Valeria, who passed it to the district attorney's office. 2 days later, an arrest warrant was issued for willful fraud, financial exploitation of vulnerable adults, and falsification of official documents. Cassandra was picked up at a country club where, according to the officers who served the warrant, she had just finished an afternoon of doubles tennis. She didn't go quietly. Witnesses said she accused the arresting officer of trespassing on privileged property and demanded to speak to a superior civilian authority. The story hit the local news by evening. A segment on Channel 7 showed a blurry photo of the warrant with the headline, "HOA President Accused of Embezzlement and Targeted Fraud." The neighborhood group chat lit up like a bonfire. People who'd never spoken to each other before were now trading stories, comparing notices, and digging through old records. One resident, a quiet mechanic named Jonah, discovered that he'd been fined for visible tool clutter 3 years ago, a penalty that had never been logged in the HOA's official records. He still had the check receipt, made out to Cassandra personally. "She told me the HOA didn't accept online payments yet," Jonah said. "Said she'd handle it directly. I didn't think twice." That check was now evidence. The district attorney's office opened a community restitution case seeking to recover funds that had been improperly collected. They assigned a financial crimes prosecutor, a sharp-suited woman named Gloria Chen. She had a reputation for turning HOA abuse cases into precedent-setting convictions. At the preliminary hearing, Gloria laid out the case in calm, precise language. This was not a bureaucratic mistake. It was a pattern of manipulation. The defendant created fictional violations, pressured vulnerable residents, and diverted funds for personal use, all under the guise of neighborhood governance. Cassandra's attorney tried to argue that she had acted in the best interest of the community, but the judge interrupted him. "I've reviewed the evidence. That line of defense will not hold in this courtroom." Trial was set for the following month. Meanwhile, the Oversight Committee continued its work. We brought in a retired accountant named Marcy to help clean up the books. She found additional discrepancies in the landscaping budget payments made to companies that didn't exist on any business registry. Likely shell accounts. The total amount still unaccounted for was nearing $22,000. We filed a civil suit on behalf of the HOA, separate from the criminal charges, to recover those funds. Cassandra's assets were frozen pending the outcome, but the real shift came in how the neighborhood responded. People started attending meetings not to complain, but to contribute. A group of teenagers volunteered to repaint the park benches. Alyssa organized a community garden day. Even Eugene, who'd once been too timid to challenge Cassandra, proposed a rotating leadership schedule to prevent power hoarding. One afternoon, while clearing out the last of the old HOA storage boxes, I found a stack of unused violation slips, the same kind Ron had received, all with blank dates and forged signatures. I turned them over to the DA's office. That discovery added a charge of document fraud to Cassandra's growing list. By the time her trial began, the courtroom was standing room only. Several residents testified, including Jonah and Dana. Each gave calm, factual accounts of what they'd experienced. When it was my turn, I brought the original property survey, the technician's report from the severed power line, and the full documented timeline of the aftermath. Gloria asked me a single question. "Why did you get involved?" I looked at the judge. "Because I got tired of people like her thinking they're untouchable." The jury deliberated for only 6 hours. Cassandra was found guilty on all counts: embezzlement, targeted fraud, document falsification, and financial abuse of authority. She was sentenced to 4 years in state prison and ordered to repay restitution in full. After the verdict, the community gathered in the park, the same one she'd once tried to reserve exclusively for board-approved events. No one said her name. We didn't need to. Instead, we talked about what came next. We passed a motion to dissolve the old HOA charter and rewrite it from scratch, with full transparency clauses, mandatory public audits, and a zero-tolerance policy for unilateral fines or enforcement. The power line was long since repaired. The grass had grown back, but the neighborhood had changed in ways that went deeper than property lines or landscaping. It belonged to its people again. And this time, no one would let it be taken. The courtroom sat quiet, the kind of quiet that makes every chair creak sound like a firecracker. Cassandra sat at the defense table, her posture rigid, jaw clenched. It was the final day of trial, and the prosecution had just called its last witness not a neighbor, not a board member, but a forensic accountant from the state's Office of Financial Integrity. She wore gray slacks and a maroon blouse, her voice even as she explained the paper trail that tied Cassandra not only to the embezzled funds, but also to a second, far more serious discovery. A hidden account used to funnel reserve funds into a private trust under Cassandra's name. She'd opened it 2 years prior, listing the HOA as a nonprofit grant sponsor. The total amount moved through that account was staggering over $64,000. The judge leaned forward. And was this account ever disclosed in any HOA meeting minutes or financial statements? No, Your Honor. Based on our review of the HOA's bylaws and documentation, this account was never authorized, disclosed, or subject to board approval. Outside the courthouse, the wind had picked up. News vans were parked along the curb now, their cameras angled for a glimpse of the woman who had turned a neighborhood association into her personal ATM. Inside, the jury sat frozen, their expressions shifting from disbelief to quiet fury. I sat in the third row, listening. My hands were folded but not clenched. I wasn't angry anymore. That had passed weeks ago. What I felt now was something colder, a kind of focus sharpened by months of uncovering rot layer by layer. When the prosecution rested, Cassandra's attorney stood, buttoned his jacket, and launched into closing arguments. He used words like misunderstood, overwhelmed, and over-reliance on informal practices, but it was clear no one bought it. Even the court clerk looked unimpressed. The jury returned their verdict before the sun had set, guilty on all counts. The judge didn't delay sentencing. Cassandra was sentenced to 5 years for financial misconduct, with an additional 18 months tacked on for criminal impersonation due to her forging resignation letters and internal documents. Her assets, including the trust account, were ordered liquidated to repay the restitution fund. But that wasn't the end of it. A separate investigation by the state attorney general's office had been triggered after the forensic team flagged another anomaly. The HOA had received a grant 2 years earlier, a state-funded community improvement grant worth $25,000 earmarked for green space development. According to the records, that money had been spent on a tree planting initiative, complete with photos submitted to the state showing new planters, benches, and landscaping. Except those photos weren't of our neighborhood. They were taken from a suburban development 80 miles away. Cassandra had submitted them through a dummy email tied to a fake landscaping company registered in another state under a shell LLC. When the state investigators confronted her with the evidence during a second deposition, she refused to answer. Her attorney eventually entered a no-contest plea on her behalf to avoid federal fraud charges. The state revoked the HOA's eligibility for public grants indefinitely and opened a separate fraud recovery claim to pursue the misused funds. The fallout was nuclear. The insurance premiums on the HOA's liability coverage skyrocketed, and the board was forced to dissolve its existing financial accounts and open new ones under a court-appointed financial trustee. The oversight committee, now fully converted into a transitional board, had to meet every week for 2 months just to stabilize the neighborhood's governance structure. But something unexpected happened amid the chaos. People stepped up. Not the usual suspects, no self-appointed rule enforcers or clipboard warriors, but regular neighbors. A group of young parents volunteered to manage the park maintenance schedule. A retired civil engineer named Lyle opened a free Saturday workshop on home repair codes so residents wouldn't get caught off guard by building permits or inspection traps. And then there was Evelyn. She was in her late 60s, soft-spoken, always wore a sun hat. Cassandra had once fined her for improper grass texture during a drought. Turns out, Evelyn had worked in municipal administration for over 30 years. She offered to help rewrite the HOA charter from scratch, not just revise it, but rebuild it from the ground up with guardrails, checks, and mandatory outside audits. The new charter eliminated discretionary fines entirely. Instead, any dispute had to go through a mediation panel elected by residents. No single person could issue warnings, levy penalties, or make changes to bylaws without full community approval. Every dollar spent had to be posted on a public ledger, available for anyone to review online. In the months that followed, the neighborhood changed in ways no one had expected. The community center, once used mostly for closed-door meetings and bland holiday flyers, was repurposed into a shared space. Movie nights, potlucks, workshops. Someone even installed a bulletin board for local businesses and services. The mistrust that had settled over the streets like fog was finally lifting. One Sunday, I was working on the front fence when Eugene walked by, waving a manila envelope. "Thought you'd want to see this," he said. Final report from the state auditor's office just came through. I set down my drill and opened the envelope. Inside was a single-page summary. It confirmed that Cassandra had misappropriated a total of $117,000 over a 3-year period. Some of it had been recovered, the rest was being pursued through civil forfeiture. I looked up. "That's more than anyone guessed," Eugene nodded. "Yeah, she was good at hiding it, but not good enough." He paused, then added, "You ever think about running for the new board?" I shook my head. "Not my thing. I'll fix a furnace, patch a roof, maybe dig through a few files. But politics? That's a younger man's headache," he laughed. "Fair enough, just figured I'd ask." As he walked off, I looked down the street. Kids were riding scooters past the mailboxes. A couple was painting their shutters together, laughing over spilled primer. For the first time since I'd moved in, the place didn't feel like a collection of houses, it felt like a neighborhood. A few days later, I got a letter from the utility company. It was a simple thank you apparently. Our case had prompted them to revise their policies on excavation damage reporting. They were now requiring HOAs to submit verified property easement documentation before approving any landscaping projects that might affect lines. I pinned the letter to my fridge. One afternoon, I drove past Cassandra's old house. It had been sold to a young couple with a toddler and a Labrador. They'd repainted the shutters and taken down the old surveillance cameras. The place looked lighter somehow. Evelyn and the new board hosted a community vote to rename the park. It had never had a real name before, just the park. Now it was officially called Restoration Green. Fitting, the past year had started with a severed power line. One cut, done without permission, without care, without accountability. But it had exposed everything: the lies, the theft, the manipulation, and by the time the dust settled, the hole had been filled in and something stronger had taken root, something worth protecting. Not just from outsiders, but from anyone who thought power gave them the right to control others. Because we'd seen what that looked like, and we weren't going back.